You're listening to Navigating the French on Paris Underground Radio. For more great content and a bonus episode of Navigating the French, please join us on Patreon.
Hello, and welcome to Navigating the French, the podcast where each episode we take a look at a French word and try and see what it tells us about French culture. I'm your host, Emily Monaco. Today I'm joined by Anna Malzy, who is talking about a word that carries a lot of weight in France, both in terms of its syntactical meaning, but also its connotations for identity, sexuality, and personhood. Femme. Welcome, Anna Malzy, to the podcast. Anna, can you tell our listeners a little bit about who you are and what you do here in France?
Ooh, hello. So yes, my name is Anna. I've lived in France for about 5 years, and I'm a freelancer. I teach, I translate, I run workshops, lots mostly to do with drama. And I moved here for a year and then met someone and have stayed. So yeah, that's kind of a brief summary of my story. And I'm interested in this subject today because my academic background is in gender studies. So I started out studying religion and got very interested in kind of different cultures' ideas about gender while I was doing my undergraduate degree. And I always have worked in the theatre and loved the theatre. And so my master's was looking at all-female productions of Shakespeare and looking at the history of those productions and looking at the difference between all-female and all-male productions and how kind of particularly like London and UK culture reads those performances. And I've just kind of stayed interested in the subject ever since. So when we started talking about this subject, I thought, great, like let's get into it. I'm super excited to share some thoughts and see what you think too.
Yeah, it's going to be so fascinating to unpack for sure. And I think, obviously the idea of gender and womanhood is fascinating, across all societies, but, specifically in France and French, it's like most Romance languages. It's a gendered language, something that we delved into a little bit on a previous episode of the podcast, genre. But I mean, so one thing in particular with this word that we're going to be discussing is the fact that it has to serve a lot of functions in French. So it's pretty tough to verify statistics like this, but experts sort of say that French is estimated to have somewhere between a quarter and a fifth of the words of English. And that's linked to a lot of complicated, things that one of my favorite of which to evoke is the fact that after William the Conqueror, the English aristocracy spoke French for 200 years. So we have just a lot of French rogue words hanging out in English.
Particularly for food.
Oh, particularly for food and animals, the animal in the field versus the animal on the plate. Completely different words in English, and in French, it's the same. But in French specifically, we have this word femme, which means both woman and wife. So I would love to hear a little bit about sort of how you perceive the way that the French internalize the fact that this is a word that has both of these meanings, which means that when you say my wife, you actually have to say my woman.
Yes, I find it so funny. So I have a wife woman, and I find it so strange saying that, like saying ma femme, because if you were to say that in English, if you said like my woman, it kind of sounds really disrespectful. I think it can sound like that. It definitely sounds more kind of like slang, and so it's sort of taken me a long time to get used to using that word in French. But I think, it is so interesting that it has to do this like kind of double duty. I spoke to my wife about it, who is French, and she said like for her it's a very, very separate term. Like she sort of doesn't see it as the same thing. But I do think that it's interesting. Like France is definitely still quite a patriarchal society in many ways. I'm sure like we'll talk about that. But it does kind of equate womanhood with therefore being married. And like in a way that is not the same for, I mean, you can talk about like mon homme, like you would talk about like my man, but your husband is a different word. It's like mari, or you can talk about mon époux. You can say mon épouse, like my spouse, but the more common word would definitely be ma femme. And so I do think that that equation of like womanhood and being a woman and being a wife, it's just kind of closer, and it's very interesting that there isn't that separation, whereas with a man there is not that same, like there are different words for husband and man, even though you can use man as like, yeah, like my guy. So yeah, it is an interesting one, and it's something that I kind of found, certainly coming from the, as the French would say, the Anglo-Saxon context. I sort of found that a bit of a like a difficult thing to get used to, and a sort of strange thing to say, because also like as a feminist, I don't want to like I don't want to talk about like my woman. I want to use like kind of a nicer way of talking about my wife, but no choice here. It's the same word, so it is interesting. It's a strange one. I think when I first noticed that, I sort of hesitated at saying it, and then wanted to say like épouse or say something different, and that kind of sounds a bit too formal. So like, no, it is the word that people use, but it's interesting that they're just so closely linked in that sense.
Yeah, and I think you brushed up against something super interesting as well, which is that, you know, your womanhood is closely linked to, it's not just that you're calling your wife your woman, it's also the fact that, do you only get to be called a woman once you're married?
Yes.
Is your womanhood, you know, incumbent on your status as a married person? And I think that kind of bleeds into a concept that you brought up when we were talking about this earlier, which is, you know, Simone de Beauvoir famously saying that you're not born a woman, but you become one. And so how do you, is there a way in France to become a woman in the, you know, in the cultural sense without marrying? And what do you think Simone de Beauvoir was kind of getting at when she was evoking that?
That quotation is so fascinating, because I think there's so many things there. Like, first of all, I think that encompasses such an open idea about womanhood. That idea that it's something, you know, kind of like that then gets, when we get into like Judith Butler, that sense of like becoming gendered, and your culture and your surroundings are what kind of create your gender. And so I think that quotation, like Simone de Beauvoir is sort of so ahead of her time in saying that. But that sense of like gender as a social construct, I don't think is something that's very accepted in France. I don't think is something that people, I think it's changing. But I think in general, that isn't really how a lot of people and a lot of feminists see the concept of womanhood, that it's something that kind of gets put onto you. Like Judith Butler talks about how like from the moment you're born, you get like girled or boyed as soon as the doctor says it's a girl or it's a boy. Like that's this like lifelong journey of your gender becoming a thing that is sort of this costume that you wear. So this quotation from Simone de Beauvoir is, I love it, but I find it slightly sometimes a bit incongruous with like French thought. Like I know I guess in the US and definitely in the UK, like you can use Ms, like MS, as your title. That's the same in the US, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Right. I don't think there isn't an equivalent of that here, is there? Like I haven't come across, like you're either mademoiselle or madame, and madame is for someone who is married. It can be for someone who is older, like, you know, if you're not married, if no one knows, but like in a shop you would be referred to as like madame if they think that you're kind of, I guess, like over 30. I don't think that there is as you can kind of tell by my stumbling response, this answer is so kind of complex, because I also think like the idea of like marriage in France is very interesting. Like it definitely confers status, but it's also not quite so, I get the sense it's not as fundamental in society in like, certainly like in the UK. Like there are a lot of people who I know, like older people, like people from older generations who like weren't married when they first started having kids, or decided never to get married, or lots of people get paxed, so like civil partnered, and decide like not to get married. And marriage is very much a civil thing here. Like it's totally divorced from, for many people, it's totally divorced from a kind of religious significance. So it really is a kind of legal status. But whether that confers kind of status on a woman, and whether there is this thing of like, yeah, you don't kind of really fully become a woman until you're married, That I'm not sure about, but I do think like having children is definitely this sort of like held up as this very, very big thing. Like, I mean, probably everywhere, but there is that idea of like being a woman is like so inherently linked to like having children. I have noticed like we are on a journey at the moment into having a child, and you do get that sense that it's sort of like you're kind of joining the woman club. That might not be a specifically French thing, it's just I'm experiencing it here. But I think Simone de Beauvoir, when she's saying this, probably is talking about these quite visible physical enactments of femininity, I suppose, and like womanhood. So like getting married or having children, that then later kind of branches of feminism and then gender studies kind of take to be more cultural and more about labeling, and rather than like kind of action of like typical, babies and marriage things. So I think we take de Beauvoir's, or certainly like now we take this quotation of de Beauvoir's that you become a woman to sort of mean this like you're being gendered all the time. But I suspect that it was more a kind of as you learn to like embrace your sexuality and get married and have a baby, that's what it means to become a woman.
Okay, wow. So very much awesome stuff to unpack here. So first of all, going back to what you were saying about Ms., I think that's a really interesting kind of cultural discrepancy, because you're right that historically in France we have mademoiselle and madame, but beginning in the 70s, French feminists started to not want to use mademoiselle, and it was actually officially in 2012 the French government, well, the French prime minister called for the deletion of the word mademoiselle on all of your sort of official documents. So
Oh, interesting.
so no one is technically your madame status, your feminine, your womanness is no longer linked to your marital status in France, which I think we're also seeing, as you mentioned, reflected in the sort of cultural abandonment of the married. People don't necessarily in this country, at the state at which a relationship progresses to a certain state in the States, where state in the States, that was fun.
Love it.
When a relationship progresses to a certain status in France, instead of saying let's get married, I find that people either buy a house or have a child.
Yes, I agree. I completely agree with you.
Okay.
Marriage definitely has this kind of slightly like less, I don't know, it's just not such a big deal.
Yeah, and I think in straight couples, it often seems to have like almost a religious connotation. Like we're getting married because, we want to get married in a church, or you'll see people getting married long after the fact. Like they've already built a family together, they have children, and they decide to get married kind of long after that fact. And I don't know yet, what we're going to see in terms of trends among France's queer population, because obviously marriage equality is a relatively new thing here. So it doesn't have those long years of cultural implications in terms of marriage.
No, that's true. I would be very interested. I don't know the statistics, but it would be fascinating to see if there's a kind of comparable study between like I don't know how you would do this study, but like straight couples and queer couples who've been together for the same amount of time and kind of similar age, similar sort of life stages of life, and to see what kind of percentages, what differences there are between those who decide to get married and those who don't. Because I suspect amongst queer couples, like there probably is a higher percentage of marriage because it was something that people had to fight for, and it was a hard fought battle in France. So I suspect that there is a kind of extra status conferred to marriage probably amongst the queer population here, or anywhere where it's been a fight. But I don't think that it's so, like, certainly for like queer women, I don't think it's a kind of confirmation of womanhood in this sense. I think it's more like this is a thing that we want that gives us equal footing with straight people.
I would agree with you 100%. If you're enjoying this episode of Navigating the French, you may also be interested in our sister podcast, Storytime in Paris, where each week host Jennifer interviews a different author about his or her book set in Paris or France. Navigating the French will be right back after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Navigating the French. I think there was a huge push when they instituted the Pax in France, which is this sort of civil union, it's like getting married, but it's very much not. Like it's got some of the benefits of being married. You're under one tax home. You can, in certain contexts, you can pax your foreign-born partner and get them on the path towards French citizenship, but it's not as cut and dried as it would be if you'd actually gotten married, things like that. But there was a huge push before marriage equality in France among I mean, I'm going to assume straight legislators, although honestly, I don't know what their identity was, but people saying basically, well, you have the pax, you can get paxed. Why do you also need to get married?
Yep.
And so I think that when marriage equality was finally, as you say, hard fought for and won by, queer French people, I think there was a huge influx of marriage among queer couples, whereas the straight couples started getting paxed, which was always kind of painted as like, marriage junior for queer people.
Yeah, that's so funny. It was the same, like in the UK, I think the same thing. Like there was a lot when the civil partnership status came in, which was basically, yeah, like that's your version of getting married, queer people. But then, yeah, people fought for marriage because the idea was like equal status, and this sort of semantic argument that in the UK is very much more closely linked to the Church of England. Afterwards, like there was a straight couple who they went to court. I don't know who they were suing, but they went to court to say like we want a civil partnership. And now I think it's open to anyone to get civil partnered. But there isn't really a difference now in the UK, like not a different league. It's not like the Pax, which is kind of, sort of marriage light. But yeah. So yeah, it's funny, like, like, okay, the status, like this idea of equality, like, oh, it's funny that you don't like that something's closed off for you. Huh.
Exactly. Huh, how weird. You touched on another really interesting element of kind of womanhood in France, which is this idea that it's associated with motherhood. I kind of often say tongue-in-cheek that a lot of modern French novels written by women follow the same trajectory, which is that a woman finds out that she's pregnant and also finds out that her mother is terminally ill on the same day.
That's so true.
And so she's becoming a mother and losing her mother at the same time, and that's where womanhood lives.
So many novels.
So many. So this idea of womanhood being linked to your ability, desire, decision, or, it just happens upon you to become a mother, that conflation of motherhood and womanhood in France seems pretty pervasive. And as we were saying, if women aren't getting married, then does that sort of almost confirms them as a woman. Now, what's kind of interesting too in France is, of course, that again, in that push for equality, we have more parental leave that could be assigned to either parent than you do in many other countries. But I'm curious kind of whether you see that sort of this incarnation of womanhood as being someone who's going to have a child, and then also this roping in of the other partner, whether that's the other mother or the father, and doing this sort of, how do you sort of perceive that as being something that assigns parenthood, womanhood? Where does that sort of divide live in the way that the French are legislating around parental leave?
Yeah, that's so interesting because paternity leave, as it's called, or like parental leave, I guess as I would prefer to call it, has recently doubled. So it used to be 11 days, and it's now 22 or 25, and the kind of discrepancy is because it counts weekends.
Okay.
So it's like 25 consecutive days, but so that's sort of supposed to be, I think that you get 21 working days, but then the other days can count. I'm not quite exactly sure, but it does definitely include weekends, which kind of seems bizarre. But that recently got doubled. So it's still not much, but it's double what there was a year ago, I think. So that obviously, I think that has helped, certainly in terms of equality and certainly in terms of like involving the other partner. But it has the same, it's sort of the same kind of issue with the UK are kind of sorting it out, but the parental the money that you get from the state is not great. So there are still plenty of like the, you know, the kind of non-birthing partner. If you earn more money, then it's sort of, for many people, it's not really in their interest to even take that leave, or it's better to take holiday because you'll get your pay. So I do think that there is an effort to see parenting particularly as a more equal activity. And I do think that you can see a lot of campaigns, like even advertising campaigns, you see a lot of like, you know, like it's talk in terms of like straight couples, like you see a lot of dads involved. There was a big campaign a few years ago about like the first 1,000 days, and that was specifically speaking to fathers and like trying to encourage involvement of fathers in their first 3 years of their children's lives. So I do think that that is kind of this idea that like parenting or like motherhood is this, you know, sole kind of realm of women and like the birthing partner. I do think that that is changing. Whether that's kind of affecting this idea of does that take something away from the kind of the status of the person who gave birth, of like the woman, or like, I don't know. But it's certainly, I think that there is definitely a move towards equality. To your point about like, about kind of giving birth, I don't know how, or like about the first part of your question, I don't know how relevant this is, so you can cut this if it's not relevant. But I find it so interesting being a woman and being involved in the process of like my wife giving birth, because of course, like when I talk to people, like I talk to students online and say like my partner and I are having a baby, they obviously like think that I'm myself am pregnant. And so this isn't the reason why I don't know if this is relevant, is because it's not necessarily like a French context thing, but it is interesting being a woman, like going to like birthing classes and understanding the kind of anatomical side of things in a way that the male partners who are there don't. And then, but then also like not understanding it at all because I'm not pregnant. I don't know how it feels. And I definitely think that I am treated differently. Like, I think I have an advantage. Like I think like being a woman, like there is this kind of, this is what I mean about a kind of club thing. Like when you're in the hospital, like or when we're with like midwives, and like, I know exclusively the medical professionals we have dealt with so far have all been women. But it's interesting that like I don't feel very excluded, because even though I'm not the one who's pregnant, I am a woman. And so I think that there is this sort of like, oh yeah, you kind of know what we're talking about because you're in this club. But like, I've never had a baby. I don't know what they're talking about. I don't know how it feels. So there is this sort of weird sort of hybrid status that I certainly feel at the moment.
Yeah, and I think that I mean, that does seem to sort of play into it as well. Is like, obviously that's something that you would probably have experience with whether you were in France or not.
Exactly. Yeah.
But I do think it's really interesting to see, for you to be kind of observing, you know, with your background in the academia side of this, to be observing, you know, is your status as a woman being called into question in any way because you're not the pregnant partner?
Yeah.
And I mean, it sounds as though from that you've had an experience that the answer seems to be no, but I don't know if that's how you feel about it.
Yeah, I think I've been very lucky. I do think also because I come from a country where, and I mean, I'm definitely have a kind of great bubble of friends, you know, in the UK. But I do also find that the UK is just a lot more relaxed about this kind of thing, about like having, you know, like, oh, okay, you're two women having a baby, fine. Like that just seems to be, not that the UK is not perfect. The UK has got a lot of issues around gender discrimination, around discrimination against queer people, all sorts of things. But I do think that there is a bit more like, there is a kind of greater sort of sense of acceptance sometimes. And I think because of that, I have been almost belligerent about, yes, this is my wife, we're having a baby. Anyway, like, let's carry on. You know, kind of, I'm very like, I refuse for it to be a thing, which I don't know, it's just sort of like a bit of a kind of bullishness in me. I've had a few people saying, like, just asking, you know, nicely, like, oh, you know, do you think, like at school, like, is it going to be strange for your baby? And my stock response is like, well, actually, I think it's a real advantage that they have one English-speaking parent and one French-speaking parent. And like, yes, it might be a bit strange for them at the beginning that they hear two languages at home, but actually I think it's going to be, you know, an advantage in the long run. I refuse to kind of entertain the fact that people would like point us out and make us different and make us sort of want to feel, or make us feel different because we're two women having a child. And so I do think that that kind of helps, because I think that because I refuse to be apologetic about that or kind of like weird about it, that people just sort of don't have a choice. And I don't want to give anyone a choice to kind of be like, oh, that's strange. But also maybe that's me being kind of, I'm sort of being defensive before I need to be. Actually, maybe people that, you know, wouldn't react in any kind of in any way.
Well, I mean, I don't know, but I do know that, I mean, what you said about coming from the UK where it's become less of a thing, that does sort of ring true in some things that we're seeing arising in French society, and specifically within the realm of the waves of feminism. I think one thing I'm really interested to get into with you is essentially, you know, when we think about the waves of feminism, the French were all gung-ho about it at the beginning. We got our second wave feminism rights pretty quickly. You know, French women notably fought for and won the right to safe abortion in 1975. And yet they didn't have the right to vote until 1944. And there was a law on the books in France until 2013 that women were not allowed to wear pants, which is basically about cross-dressing and posing as a man.
That is crazy.
So how, you know, with the experience that you have, you know, both personal and academic, what are your thoughts on how France was so, I mean, it was quite kind of a tortoise and the hare race for feminism, where we got a certain number of rights here and it was like, that's enough. Now we're done.
Yeah.
And any pushes towards anything more than that are met with quite a bit of resistance here.
This is such an interesting subject. And when you sent me these questions, like it just, I think one of the biggest things about this, like one thing that I really, really want to talk about is the idea of égalité. Like the French kind of motto of the nation is liberté, égalité, fraternité. And like that idea of égalité is so fundamental in like discourse around any kind of identity. So I think with like second wave feminism and like French feminism in general, like if you read like Hélène Cixous and people like that, their feminism is so kind of like, it's like beautiful. Like the way they write is gorgeous, and the way they write about women's bodies and like the territory of a woman's body, and often related to like motherhood as well. It's beautiful and it's very literary and very kind of French in that kind of like, there's something romantic about it. The third wave of feminism, or like subsequent waves of feminism, I feel very much characterized by like lived experience and something far greater investigation, like interrogation into like what it does actually mean to be a woman, and like what are these labels, and this sense of, like then kind of going into more women's studies as opposed to gender studies that we kind of see more, I think, in Anglo-Saxon, in the US, and like in UK academic institutes. So I think that sense is very interesting, that kind of next step sort of hasn't happened so much in French feminism. But then this idea of égalité, I think that this is like such an amazing ideal, and it really kind of screws up fights for justice and fights for better rights in France. I read a really interesting book that the name of escapes me, and I'm going to find it, and so you can like put it in the show notes. But it was an American guy who was writing about his experiences of living in France during the 80s and 90s. And he made a really interesting point, because he was a gay man in Paris, and here kind of during the AIDS crisis. And he made this point that France was, arguably, between France and the US, France was the very first country to identify the HIV virus and to kind of find out what it was and what just chemically what was going on, and what this thing was that was killing people. But the response in France to like providing care and to providing protection and information to particularly to gay men about the virus was so slow compared to like Germany, the US, the UK, other countries. And this guy in this book put it down to the fact that France doesn't really go in for identity politics. And because of this like emphasis on the idea of equality, there isn't such a strong sense of grassroots organizations that are based on identity. And he was even saying, like, in terms of like writers, you wouldn't characterize yourself as like a queer writer or a gay writer or a woman writer or a black writer. Those kind of things, like you wouldn't put yourselves in those categories. You'd be like a French writer, and that's your kind of, that's as much as you would categorize yourself. And I thought that was such an interesting idea, because he said like therefore it meant that there weren't these groups there wasn't such a strong culture of having these grassroots organizations that could say, like, we are specifically being affected by this disease, and, like, overwhelmingly it's us who, we're the ones who are dying. And so in other places there was a much stronger sense of that, and so there was much more mobilization, much more like campaigning, all those kind of things, whereas in France that took a lot longer. And I do think that this idea of égalité it sort of wants to treat everybody the same. So when you get, for example, like women trying to like fight for greater rights, like, yes, there was a huge kind of post-Second World War, like getting the vote, and then with Simone Weil and Simone de Beauvoir, lots of, great feminists like that, getting kind of physical rights around, particularly around abortion. Then, like, it's sort of like, okay, you're equal now. You've got those big things, but like now can we not? Like, can we please not, be like talking about all these individual groups, because we are, we're equal. And it's a way of, it doesn't mean equal, or it's an interesting interpretation of equality, right? You can kind of have that sense of like everyone's the same, or this idea of everyone is different but should be treated in the same way. And that, I think, can sometimes be a bit of a stumbling block in terms of getting greater rights, and even like having a conversation about discrimination, because I think there is this sort of sense of no, like, we're France, our like main tenet is equality, everyone's treated equally. It's kind of a similar thing, like this is kind of related to being a woman, but it's not exactly the topic of our conversation. But like, it's like with the veil, there is this sense of like, well, why should we give you, you Muslim women, why should you have any like more right than anyone else to like display a symbol of your religion? No, nobody displays any symbol of their religion, which is a way of being equal, but it's not treating people the same, or it's not kind of giving everybody the same kind of respect, or, affording them the same kind of treatment in a way, because it's like, yes, you will look the same, but you've actually taken away someone's choice to wear what they want. And so that's sort of, I think this idea of equality is a very like interesting concept in France that actually can be it can trip people up a bit.
Oh, 1,000%. If you're enjoying this episode of Navigating the French, you may also be interested in our sister podcast, Romancing in Paris, which delves into love, lust, and so much more in the City of Light. Navigating the French will be right back after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Navigating the French. So longtime listeners of the podcast will probably remember that on our episode on d'origine, we talked about the French fear of communautarisme, which is the French fear of building little sub-communities, which is why it's part of the reason why we don't really ascribe to hyphenated identities in France. So you would never say that, in the way that you might say you were African American or Asian American in the US, you would never say that you were Afro-French.
Right.
And I think that, it's all about kind of flattening the edges of our identities and pretending that we all need the same thing, when the reality is that we're all pretending that what we need is the same things that a white, able-bodied, straight man needs.
Yep, absolutely.
And I mean, that's something we talk about in feminist circles, and in circles that sort of deal with the issues of racial and religious discrimination all over the world. But I think in France, you're right, it's particularly pervasive because of this false idea we have of universalism as a reality instead of a utopia. And I don't even know that it's everybody's utopia. It's a utopia of a certain type of white, able-bodied man.
And it's this idea exactly that everyone starts in the same place, which we know is not true.
Right.
And like meritocracy is a great idea, but it doesn't work. Not everyone is starting from the same starting line, but there is this sense, like I get a feeling that there is this sort of like almost like fingers in ears, like la 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 la, like no, we're all exactly the same. Don't ask for anything different. Don't stand out. I'm constantly surprised whenever I take the Eurostar and like travel through Paris, where there is a certain, you can tell you're in France, I think. Like there's a certain uniformity about dress. People don't talk very loudly on the underground, on the metro. Like people kind of keep to themselves. And then you get out at St. Pancras and get on the underground, and like people have blue hair, people are dressed as Spider-Man, people are like talking and laughing and maybe being annoying, but there is just a kind of different way of comporting yourself in public, even, that is about conformity, I feel, in France more. Not that there aren't people who stand out, or there aren't people who kind of, but it's like the idea of standing out in France is not something that is valued, I don't think, not so much. Whereas I think in the UK we have this sense of the eccentric is a sort of cultural trope that we enjoy. And so actually standing out is kind of like, can be quite fun and silly. But here it's considered like, ooh, you don't want to stand out.
Yeah, you don't even want to wear like a brightly colored winter coat in this
Right.
country.
Nope.
No.
Why isn't your coat gray, black, or navy blue?
Exactly.
That's it.
And I mean, I love that about English culture in general and London culture in particular, that heterogeneity of just the population. It's fantastic.
And that's the thing, it doesn't always work, but there is definitely, I do think in many ways, like integration sort of has possibly been more successful in London than in Paris.
Yeah, I think so.
Because there is a kind of recognition of difference, actually.
Right. Now, it's very difficult to transition from this topic to another element of French womanhood, but gosh darn it, I'm going to try.
You're going to do brilliantly.
Well, we can't talk about the perception of womanhood in France without talking about the sexualization of the female body in France. And you talked a little bit earlier about Simone de Beauvoir and sort of different writings about the French body and French women's sexuality. You talked as well about the veil and sort of this resistance we have towards the covering of the French body, of the French woman's body, not the French body, the woman's body in France. But one thing that I think is interesting to witness as someone coming from an Anglo-Saxon, Anglo-American culture with our Protestant leanings is that sexuality in France is often fairly open. The French are famously less prudish about sex and about naked bodies than the US is. So, for example, I know that, when I first moved here in the early 2000s, you would see, boobs being used to advertise fish fingers. And,
yeah, right.
It's kind of wild. And I think whereas Americans maybe are a little bit more non-sensitized to violence on television, the French are pretty non-sensitized to sexualization. I won't say sexuality, but to sex and to the commodification of sex. And I think one really interesting kind of discrepancy is the same year that Janet Jackson accidentally flashed America, Sophie Marceau accidentally flashed France, and the reactions were so ridiculously different. Like it was just sort of like, oh yeah, that's a boob in France, whereas in America it was this huge scandal.
Right, where Janet Jackson was like vilified, right?
Absolutely, yeah. So how do you kind of interpret this? I think there's two sides to this coin, because on the one hand, it's like women can go topless on the beach. You can feel free to dress however you'd like and not necessarily be thought of in any particular, there's less vilification of a woman who wants to dress in a certain way to show off her body, but women who want to cover their body in a way that feels right to them are vilified. And it almost does feel, here we go, here's some gender theory 101. It really does feel guided by the male gaze. And, specifically in France until 1975, a man could legally kill his adulterous wife. So you can be sexual, but not too sexual.
Yeah.
So how do you sort of interpret this?
I think this is kind of, if you think about like the sexual revolution of the 60s, I think we have a kind of similar thing happening where, like, yes, there was a revolution and yes, like society became more free, but who did it become more free for? It didn't really necessarily become freer for women. Like the contraceptive pill, like definitely, was a huge aid to sexual liberation, but it wasn't for queer people. It was pretty much like a revolution for men. And I think that, or it's certainly guided by, like you say, like guided by a kind of male gaze and a male, sexual desire. And I do think I think we still see that really strongly in France. Like the fact that you can go topless on a beach, but like a bikini is banned. That I think, again, it's a sort of sense of like égalité. Like, no, are you like, can't you see what everyone else is wearing? You should wear that. And it is, I think that France is definitely like, you know, it's the pays d'amour of like romantic love. Like there is a kind of very open discussion of of romance and love. But I don't think in terms of sexuality, I do think it's still very male driven and very patriarchal. And that idea of like women's bodies being it is interesting that now I think that there are, like you said, you know, you could have ads, you know, 10, 15 years ago with women's boobs advertising fish fingers, for example, like that has now, I don't think we would see that now. And I think that has been a direct result of feminist campaigning saying like, actually, that's maybe not okay. Like our bodies are not just there for male pleasure. So there is a greater awareness of that idea, and a kind of bigger, there's more discussion around like how women's bodies are used in the public sphere, and kind of questioning of like, is this actually liberating, or is it just for the pleasure of men to like ogle over women's bodies? But I do think that there is, there is definitely a discrepancy, that there is this sort of discussion of like, like sex and the nude and that kind of thing. But in terms of like actual like female sexuality, I do think that it's getting there, and it's still a lot of the kind of norms are guided by a straight white male gaze.
It does seem to be, I mean, I don't think this is unique to France, but it does seem to be built into French women's conception of themselves as women in a way that maybe doesn't feel quite as true, at least to me as an American. Like, for example, I know that the responses to the Me Too movement in France were often, you know, women saying, I like being flirted with. I like being catcalled. Like, let me be catcalled.
Yes.
I mean, I'm not going to tell anyone how they should feel, but I do feel like it's this, people have fully taken on this idea of the male gaze being something that validates your womanhood.
Yeah, absolutely. But then there was, because Catherine Deneuve and a few other actors wrote that open letter saying, oh, we love being catcalled. But then there was a very strong backlash, I think, amongst younger French feminists saying like, oh my God, you've misunderstood. Like, that's not the point. So I do think that it is changing, but I agree that there is very much this sort of, it's like, you know, the female body is something to be idolized, and that idolization is what ascribes value. And I think that question is becoming more, or that idea is becoming more nuanced.
If you're enjoying this episode of Navigating the French, you may enjoy our sister podcast, Life in Diasporas, which attempts to understand what it means to be Black in a European country in the 21st century through enlightened and thoughtful discussions. Listen now to Life in Diasporas on Paris Underground Radio. Navigating the French will be right back after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Navigating the French. Now, in a very gendered language and a country that sort of continues to uphold the traditional views of sort of the gender binary, in France, we have recently seen the introduction of a non-gendered pronoun, yel, so I-E-L, and just sort of a bigger push for the recognition of non-binary identities in the greater tapestry of society and the language. Because the language, I think, is a huge part of this, as we talked about in our episode on gender, on genre, that because all nouns in French have a gender, the language is built around something that continuously confirms the gender of a given object or person. And so if you don't ascribe to one of the binary genders, then it makes it really difficult to even just have a normal conversation in French. So we're seeing moves obviously away from that, which is pretty exciting. But we're seeing this argument as well in France that's not an unfamiliar argument in Anglo settings, but it seems more prominent and mainstream and almost acceptable in French feminist circles to say that the confirmation of a non-binary identity trods on women's rights, women's identity, the right to women-only spaces and things like that. Do you notice sort of a discrepancy in the way that these sorts of arguments are being received in France versus in Anglo circles, where I think that a large part of the feminist community in Anglo circles has a sort of vilifies this opinion and says, you can't say that somebody else confirming their identity is trotting on yours. Do you see that people are perceiving that differently in France?
Oh, what a great question. I think the language thing is so huge. Like, I don't think we can underestimate how difficult it is for non-binary people to insert themselves and talk about themselves and be talked about in a language that is gendered. And yeah, you talked about that in your episode on gender. It was so interesting. I sometimes think there is a kind of sense of like, it's just sort of too hard, we're not going to try. And again, coming back to this idea of égalité, it's like, why do you need something different? Why do you want to do anything? Why do you want to stand out and be different? We've got words, you just use those. And also who was it? Jean-Michel Blanquer or Jean Castex, I can't remember who it was, but someone in the French government who said that yell is like, that's not how we want the French language to go. Like, that's just not French. It's not right. So I do think that there is a lot of resistance to non-gendered pronouns. And I think that it is seen not just by women, because I think there can be this discourse of like, don't reduce my femininity, and kind of argument that I absolutely don't ascribe to, that yeah, exactly, it's sort of like you're like taking territory away from me, which I don't think is true. It's like, it's a big church, we're just expanding the territory. No one's losing ground because we've got a more nuanced understanding of gender. But I think that there is maybe a sense of like, yeah, it's like we would have to change so much. Like, how do we even change all these nouns? How do we change these pronouns? That there is less of an effort made, because in kind of just even intellectually, it's quite an exercise to then kind of work out, but not an impossible one. Not, but I think that there is this sort of almost like there's a sort of inherent resistance that you just get from the way that the language is structured that makes this quite hard. But I do see that it is being used even more. Like, yell was kind of, I think even a year ago, I never saw yell being used. And now you do see online, and even in subtitles, like French subtitles. I was watching something where there was a non-binary character and had the subtitles in French, and noticed they were using yell. Whereas I think before I have seen either like he or she being used, or il or elle rather. So it is moving, it is changing. But again, I do think that this idea of égalité kind of trips people up, because it's like, why do you want to be different? Why would you add something? That's also the thing. I think that there isn't this nuanced idea, or this idea of gender as a spectrum is maybe not so mainstream in France, and maybe not something that is sort of talked about in such an accepted way. And so it to many people, they think, oh, you're kind of adding an identity. But actually, I think a lot of people would see it as like, no, these identities are already here. It's just now we have language to talk about them, and to kind of discuss them. Just the last thing I want to say is like, I do have a lot of hope. I teach university students, and I recently went to a Pride March where I think like my wife and I were the oldest people there. And that was quite surprising, because, and like joyfully surprising, there were just so many young people who are very like unbothered by non-binary pronouns, by dressing differently, by being very like, in terms of like queerness, like being very visible allies, but then also in terms of feminism, being very like strong about fighting for their rights and for their bodies. And so I definitely, and also with my university students, talking to them about yell, a lot of them were like, oh yeah, we use that, we think it's like normal and fine, and the government are weird, and the Académie Française can just like, who cares what they think. So I do have hope that there, things are changing, and things are hopefully getting easier for women and for non-binary people and queer people in this country. It's a long and winding road, but I do think it's getting easier.
I love that message of hope. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I'm excited to see that things are moving and shaking and progressing in a French, but also a universal way. So that's going to be exciting to see moving forward. Well, thank you so much, Anna, for joining me on the podcast. Where can people find you and hear more of your brilliance?
Oh, thank you, Emily, for having me. This has been really fun. I very sporadically post on Twitter at AJ Malzy. And other than that, my online presence is kind of a bit lacking. Most of my writings and thoughts go into a variety of notebooks that are sort of scattered around my desk that one day will hopefully come together and be a bit more coherent. But one of the projects that I'm working on is with an independent publishers called the Pirate Press Co. We're currently doing a free creative writing course, which people can sign up to on our website. I'll put the details up about that. But Pirate Press Co. is where my main creative output goes. So check that out.
Yeah, and I highly recommend it. It's an awesome platform for writers of all backgrounds and of all sort of publishing backgrounds. It's very cool to read writing from all sorts of different writers. So I'm glad that you're putting that out there. I only have one last question for you before we go, and that is, what is your favorite word in French?
Ooh, oh my gosh, what a great question. Okay, I'm going to need a second to think about this.
Oh, please.
Oh, I have so many. There's so many amazing words. But a word I use all the time is like bref. I love being like bref, because it kind of also makes you sound quite fluent, because it's sort of like, oh yeah, blah 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 bref. But there is a word that I'm hearing a lot with certainly like in terms of kids, and that is chouchouter. I hope I've got this meaning right. That it's like kind of spoiling, or kind of like, oh, like,
yeah,
when you kind of like cutesy with a kid and like chuchoting someone. Like I love the way it sounds, that I do, and that also it just sort of sounds quite onomatopoeic, that you kind of like, oh, look how cute you are, aren't you gorgeous, and let me give you whatever you want, like let me spoil you. And so yeah, chuchoter is just,
I love that.
Because
chou, of course, in French is like a synonym for cute, but it's also the word for cabbage, which
exactly
is fun.
It's very fun.
Instead of honey bun, we call each other my little cabbage in this country.
Yeah, or my mother-in-law calls my wife her little puce, which is a flea.
A flea.
A flea.
Ma biche, okay. My female deer.
Yes. Okay.
Why not?
Yeah. Sure. Okay.
Yet another gendered point.
Yes.
But we have carried on. So I appreciate so much you joining me on the podcast today, Anna. Thank you so very much, and hopefully speak with you soon.
Yay.
This has been Navigating the French. You can find more from me, Emily Monaco, at Emily_in_France on Twitter and Instagram. This podcast is produced by Paris Underground Radio. To listen to other episodes of this podcast, or to discover more podcasts like it, please visit parisundergroundradio.com. Thanks for listening, and à bientôt.
This episode of Navigating the French was produced by Jennifer Garrity for Paris Underground Radio. For more great content, join us on Patreon at patreon.com/Paris Underground Radio.